Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Sam Feinstein. I want to say hi, welcome. Thanks to the Society of Guilders for running the Global Gilding Symposium and for letting me be a part of it. I will be demoing gold finishing, and you can find my handout on my website under the handout tab.
Firstly, I want to say, as a member of the Society of Guilders, I'm very happy that they're doing this global gilding symposium, which is gilders from all around the world doing all different kinds of gilding. I am kind of the resident bookbinder in Society of Guilders, or one of them. It's really exciting for me. It's really enjoyable for me to see all of the different workshops and lectures and processes being shared. One of the really nice things about this presentation is that we have folks here that have done no bookbinding at all. And we have folks in here that have been doing bookbinding and tooling since before I was born. That to me, that kind of breadth is really quite enjoyable, and I really do hope that I'll be able to speak to everyone's interests. A little bit about myself. I'll start with what got me into bookbinding. I was studying at UW-Madison. English and classics, and I was hit by a van on my bike ride to school one day, and I had a traumatic brain injury that left me with constant headaches, constant pain, either headaches or migraines. And doing the kind of work that I was doing at the time, which was a lot of cognition, synthesis of information, all the things that you do when you probably are going to be ending up in academics. They ended up making the pain that I was going through worse. And so I kind of had to figure out what it was that I could do. And I remember from one of my Latin classes, we were looking at a manuscript that was interesting, and I ended up finding out about bookbinding as a field. I was completely ignorant of it up until then. And finding such a niche but vibrant community and group of people was really quite amazing. And my first thought when I found out that there was a school, the North Bennett Street School, that had a 2-year craft-oriented bookbinding program, my initial thought was like, well, I could do that. I can work with my hands instead of working with my head. Of course, as is the case, I do work with my head quite a bit, doing bindings, making technical and critical decisions for, the things going into my work. But I'm not staring at a computer screen trying to write papers, or doing a lot of reading, which is something that I used to really love doing, and unfortunately now it ends up causing a fair amount of pain. So that's kind of how I found bookbinding. I found the website, the Book Arts listserv, or the Book Arts page from Peter Verheyen, and the North Bennett Street School was linked, and I applied right away. And I didn't get in because I found out about it a couple of weeks before the deadline. And I hadn't done any bookbinding at all. Then I spent the next year um, going through, going to the Newberry Library here in Chicago, seeing what was being done, what had been done, all of that. And it was really quite nice. It was I you learn a lot by going and handling the items, and there was one binding in particular. Uh, this one here, this Samuel Murn Book of Common Prayer. To me, this book is like 5 inches by 8 inches. It's quite small. And if you look here in these small areas, there's just masses of tiny little impressions. And the thing that really got me with this was like, as I'm looking at it, it looks fairly symmetrical. But when you go into it and you see where all of the different tools are placed, whether they're flowers, leaves, this little pineapple tool guy, um, it's he was improvising. He was sitting down at the piano with his band and just doing jazz. Back in this was like 1660 or so, Restoration era, and I found that to be really inspiring, and that's ultimately what got me into wanting to do leather bindings with gold tooling specifically. Now, this lovely William Morris quote: "Never forget the material you're working with, and try always to use it for what it can do best. The special limitations of the material should be a pleasure to you, not a hindrance." Um, to me, when we're doing bookbinding, and especially kind of stuff where you're tooling in gold, where there are a number of difficulties with the materials, in terms of all of the various things that need to be done to make the book into what it is. Um, for me, thinking about it in that way, instead of saying like, okay, well, I know that doing leather head caps are difficult, or doing corners are difficult. It's like, okay, but how do you approach it in a way that makes sense and works, and also ends up having the binding being something that engages the experience that's happening? How do you create something that's going to cause some sort of effect from the people looking at it? And for me, that means to explore things that are really, fairly difficult, but frankly, like, ultimately, if you're teaching yourself like I was initially, it can be difficult, but especially now, there's a lot more information being shared. There's a lot, and also on the last page of my handout, I do have some sources that you might want to check out if you're interested in learning more about finishing, specifically in bookbinding. Um, so the second time I applied to North Bennett, I did get in, and the North Bennett Street School program is a 2-year program, full time, bench oriented, where you learn a lot from doing a simple Coptic binding, historical long stitch, and then moving forward, case binding, variations on case binding, leather bindings versus leather case binding, and then getting into some more historical as well as fine bindings in your second year in the program. I did more bindings in leather than is typical for a North Bennett student. This was something that, going into it, I knew it was what I wanted to do. And one of the really amazing things that Jeff Altipater does, Jeff Altipater's the head of the bookbinding department at North Bennett. He was my primary instructor, along with Martha Kearsley. Um, and the way that Jeff structures the program is that he knows that folks are going to have a wide array of what they want to do with the skills learned there. I ultimately ended up going into private practice, doing leather binding and gold tooling, whereas some of my classmates went into conservation or did various either artist books or teaching, as well as fine binding. And the way that the program is structured, it gives you the time needed to explore things that you like. This binding was done in English Restoration style, and this was done using egg glaire. Now, what I'm going to be showing today is going to be shellac glaire, but this was done in egg glaire. And the nice thing about doing things in egg glaire is, if you have the practice, if you have built up the skills, if you're constantly doing it, you're able to get a lot of gold onto a book quickly. But it may not be absolutely perfect. Of course, this is a book from 1718. And so it would be out of place to have everything absolutely perfectly placed, because that's just not how things how things worked back in the day. You would get the decoration on a book, you would send it off, and then you would go on to the next one. Um, this one was fun because on the title page it really goes at the dude that he was criticizing with a postscript wherein his evasive answers to former objections are considered. I just love that. That's just a really nice and beautiful thing. Here's another binding I did at North Bennett. This one was done in the style of T.J. Cumberland Sanderson, who was kind of one of the main folks in the arts and crafts movement to put forth doing book bindings. He later ran and run the Doves Bindery and the Doves Press. Absolutely astonishing books, phenomenal. This was I found an essay that Cobden Sanderson had wrote, so I reformatted it, printed it out, and then did a binding in his style. And that's one way that I think is really nice to kind of build up your skills, is to work in styles of the binders or of artists or whatever that inspire you. And not only do the things kind of work a little bit easier because you're effectively copying something that's already been done, but you're able to kind of work at it in a way that is a little bit easier to approach than if you were trying to do your own design and concept and all of that. And we're really not going to talk about design that much, except for how it applies to the thing I'll be demonstrating on. This is I'm much more interested in sharing the process. So after I graduated from North Bennett, I was doing a lot of trade style finishing. Now trade style finishing is done with egg glare. Everything is done direct. There's no building up of the impressions. You can score in some lines if you want to, but for the most part, you're just doing everything by eye. For the titling, so the process on one of these spines would be, I would prepare the surface, and this is for egg glare, which is not what I'll be sharing in our demonstration. But you prep the surface of the leather. So these had a vinegar wash, a paste wash, one coat of egg glare, second coat of egg glare, and then rub some Vaseline onto the leather, lay leaf on it, and then tool through it. And egg glare, as well as shellac glare, is a heat activated size. So the gold will stick where the tool was and not stick anywhere else. And then you remove the excess afterwards. And this is a way to really get good at finishing. The best finishers are the ones who do it every day, like all year round, which, as somebody who finds his own books and does that, I don't, I can't necessarily say that the true masters are the ones that are doing it every day, day in, day out, and really just honing in on their skills. So here, this binding, one of the reasons I love this binding so much is because a lot of my work does have a fair amount of gold on it. And this, to me, at least, especially in my own work, showcases that the existence, like having gold present, can just and having gold not be present can be just as striking and just as encapsulate or engaging as having a whole lot of gold. Here, I tooled the title on the spine in moon gold, which matched the parchment of the cover. Beautiful skin from Pergamena that I did this binding in. And depending on the light, you can either see the title because you see the light bounce off of the gold, or you don't see it at all, which I thought was really, really nice and fairly effective. This one I did, 2022, if that's right. This one, you can see a lot of my work on my Instagram or on my website. My Instagram also has videos of not just of the books themselves being handled because they are three-dimensional objects. It's nice to see that. But also, I go into some of the processes that I do. This one, I did kind of a lot of work in progress stuff, whereas one binding that I'm currently working on, I am doing quite a bit of talking about the processes that I use for different decorative techniques. Um, here's one that I did early that I finished earlier in the year. Again, this is another binding that has no gold on it whatsoever. This titling here was done in foil that I tinted to match the red that, well, you can't really see it here, but lines the walls of these incisions. So this is on the handout, these next two slides, so you don't have to worry about jotting it down or anything like that. But when we're talking about tooling on leather, there are a number of factors that need to be taken into account, but the main factors are going to be heat, moisture, pressure, and dwell time. Heat, which is the heat of the tool, moisture being the moisture content of the leather, which means the moisture that you add to the leather as you're tooling through the process, but also relative humidity comes into play here quite a bit. If your book is used to being in 25% relative humidity, it may not take as deep of an impression as if it's, let's say, 60% relative humidity in your studio. So that's something to bear in mind. Tooling with shellac glare takes a lot of that relative humidity out of the question. One of the other things about egg glare is that moisture has to be present with egg glare for the size to activate. Now that means that once the leather dries out, if you're still tooling, the gold won't stick anymore. So you'll have to go back in and redo it and fix it, which is one of the many difficult features of egg glare. Shellac glare, you can tool the book when it's perfectly dry, which means dropping back into your impression is easier because wet leather will take an impression easier. And so, you want to make it's easier to go off your line or where your impression is placed on dampened or moist leather rather than dry leather. Pressure is the amount of force you're putting down into your impression, and dwell time is how long you're in the impression for. With shellac glare, when you're doing your final gilding process where you have gold on the face of the tool, you do want to have a short, sharp, and confident approach impression to adhere it. And these are some things that I find helpful when I'm doing tooling as far as my approach to it. Obviously, practice. Practice is going to give you the confidence that you need, the comfortability that you need to be able to execute your designs. And it's going to put you in the right frame of mind when you are working on it. Confidence, something that's built up through practice, of course. But the leather can tell if you're going into an impression and you're feeling shaky and you're not feeling confident about it, that will reflect in the end result. And so that's why I say that when in doubt, fake it. Remain calm, right? Whenever you make a mistake, just with any other binding operation or any other gilding operation, when you make a mistake, well, I don't know about every other, but most, the best way to approach it is to step back, relax, look at it, make a cup of tea, if that would help, and come back to the problem with a level head. There have been, probably a number of times where I've made a mistake, reacted quickly, thinking that it would be an easy fix, and then you end up just making more work for yourself, which is very, very annoying. And then focus. So especially when you're learning how to do this, effectively, as you're practicing, you're teaching yourself. You're teaching yourself what it feels like to be in an impression. You're teaching yourself the leather is giving you feedback, and you want to make sure that you're listening to it, because if you're not, then what will happen is you may end up going off your line, or you may end up, not getting everything as precise as you need to, or make a mistake that's going to take you a good long time to sort out and finish. So, yeah, that'll be the end of my slideshow. Finishing tools, generally brass or bronze, set into a wooden handle. The face is what's going to make the impression. So we have the shank, we have what here is called the table, and then here we have the face of the tool. Finishing tools, you can get them from a number of different makers. You can get them secondhand. You can make them. Brian Beidler just gave a presentation at the Guild of Bookworkers Standards seminar, and very, very good, especially if you want to make your own tools, which is something that I do, and I do like to do quite a bit. It's nice to be able to have specific tools made for specific bindings, which includes the binding I'll be demonstrating on today. So heating the tool up, over here I've got my little Thermaline hot plate. This is a student hot plate, and I think I got it on eBay like 10 years ago. I think I got two of them for like $50 or $75, something like that. And those two still work. There are some issues after about 10 years, especially after getting it secondhand, but I've got no complaints. You can also, and you very well may have seen a finishing stove like this, which I know I saw his name in here before, but I got this from John McCrell, who took this hot plate and then made a ring around it to modify it so you can have all of your tools on the stove. One thing, when you're doing a design that doesn't have that many tools for the process that you're doing, one of these little Thermaline stoves set up on really high works great. All you got to do is put your tool on there for a couple seconds, and then you move on from there, because that's about how long it takes. So that is heating up the tool. I can't really say that there's a specific number on the dial that is correct, because the ones that I have are a little, they've got some issues. And so you just try to find what works for you as you're tooling. Now, you want to make sure that you're not leaving your tool on the stove, especially when it's as hot as this one is right now. I do have a little tool holder rest thing that I made. I don't always use it. And if you leave your tool on there too long, it'll get much too hot. And then you can burn the tool out of the handle. And it really is a real bummer when you're using your tool and the tool just pops right out. Liz asks, what heat setting do I set it to generally? It depends on the stove. This one is currently at an 8, which I think is fine for this one. I'm not sure exactly if you have a newer one, what that heat setting is going to be at 8. But basically, you want it hot enough to heat the tool up quickly so that you can cool it and get back into your impression without having to sit there and wait for it. Over here, I have my cooling pad, which is not the most appetizing looking piece of equipment, but it is one of the most important as you're doing tooling. This is what's going to tell me what temperature my tool is at. And this is just some cotton batting, the stuff that you fill up quilts with. And I've folded it up and then set it into this little ceramic dish. And I've added enough water to saturate the cotton. And there's just a little bit of standing water. Now, when you are using your cooling pad, you're going to gauge the temperature of the tool based on the hiss coming from the pad. Water evaporates at 212 degrees. And so that's when the sizzle is generally going to stop. I know Don Gleister has said that up in Telluride, where he has taught finishing, and I think still does quite a lot, because the altitude, water doesn't evaporate at the same temperature, and so if you live in a place that I wouldn't say every single place, every single time you want it to be at or below a sizzle. But that's just something that you'll get more and more familiar with as you practice in your own studio and in your own place. Let me get real close to this and hopefully it'll pick up the sound. So that's a light sizzle, which is perfectly fine for what I'm doing here. You never want to put the face of the tool into the water. You're always cooling the tool on the side here. Now, it is possible for your cooling pad to give you a false read. If the tool is too hot, what can happen is it won't actually make much of a sound. And that's something that you need to be aware of. In general, if I heat it, cool it, polish it, a lot of times I'll just kind of touch it on the palm of my hand, or when I'm getting ready to go into an impression, I'll use my thumb here, and I can generally tell if it's way too hot. But that's just something that you'll learn in practice and as you're doing it. And I do suggest, and I'll do it during the demo, but I do suggest that you intentionally burn leather to teach yourself what it feels like in the milliseconds before you burn your leather, so that if it's going to happen on a real book, you can draw back and stop yourself from burning into it. This right here is a suede pad. This is just any old suede that I got. I mean, for veg tanned, you don't want anything with chrome tanned or whatever. This is going to help us polish our tools. If you see there are 3 sections, this middle section is just plain suede, and that's going to be used every single time. Heat it, cool it, polish it. Over here, I've got some Vaseline rubbed in here. That's going to be useful when we're picking gold up on the face of the tool. Then over here, I've got some honing compound or jeweler's rouge. And that's rubbed into the suede here. This, you're not going to use all that often. If you have glare deposits or stubborn, grime on the face of your tool, that's when you'll use this, but you'll use it very sparingly because it is removing metal every time you're using it as well. And yeah, this was just a suede split from some leather that I had split. I know initially a lot of the ones that I made, I got a bunch of suede splits from Pergamena, maybe 10 years ago, something like that, and they were like $5 a split, and they made great polishing pads. I know some folks will want to use like rough calf, but this works quite well. And I think that brings us to the point where we talk about designs and templates. So my initial template, now when you do your design, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the paper that you're going to use to tool through as a template. Um, but you can. My preferred paper, which isn't made anymore, is this kind of vintage, either Deatskin or K&E drafting paper. It's got this beautiful orange grid on it, and it really quite nice stuff, I think. Cool. So, yeah, this vintage drafting paper is, I just kind of found it one day in the bindery at North Bennett, and it was like tucked in a case somewhere way back that hadn't been looked at for probably, 15 years. But I found it, I like it, and it works well for me. It works both to stamp your design out and copy it with a copy machine onto a different template paper, or to use it as a template. Other paper, this here is some 36 GSM 36 GSM Japanese tissue, and I've just run this through my copy machine. This stuff works great. Ultimately, you want something that, as you're making your impression through it, effectively you're going to get the width of the tool plus 2 widths of your template paper to make your impression. So you want a thin paper so your impression doesn't kind of balloon out so that it's wider than the tool. So Japanese tissue works great. It also, one of the nice things about Japanese tissue is when you make your impression, the paper just moves, but it doesn't really pull from anywhere else for the most part. I still will make multiple tack points that I tape, but that stuff works great. And then this is just some 45 GSM bank paper that I got a while back from England, and it's just like onion skin paper, and this works just fine too. I know John Mitchell talks about using this. And I know also Michael Wilcox talked about using Permalife. They have a lighter version, Permalife Light, as template paper. And I know also that Don Gleister has talked about using acid-free tracing paper. And so there are options out there. You kind of find what you like and then, stock up on it as much as you can, because as folks, especially in the bookbinding world know, if you find something you like, it will very likely become unavailable at some point. So ultimately, when I'm making up a design, I start with ideas. I find the kind of driving force for me, and then I go from there. This is the template that I used on the actual book. Here is the book that I will be demonstrating on. And so with this design, because it goes over both boards and the spine, I taped it on, and as you can see, all of these little holes here, those are all holes that are used to kind of tack it down and keep it in place, because as you are making an impression, the paper is going to want to move a little bit. So reinforcing that. And I just use, for this one, I just use a Japanese screw punch to get all of these holes. Oh yeah, Megan, thanks. Is there a specific ink that I use for my templates? Yeah, I mean, any sort of acid-free ink. This is the one that I currently use a lot, Color Box. What I'll do is I will get one of these and I'll leave it out in the open, uncovered for a couple months, and that'll dry it out, because for the most part there's too much ink on it for what we're doing. If you have an ink that is too saturated when you make your impression on your template paper, it can just kind of get muddy, and then you end up getting a little bit of ink outside of where the tool is, which is really annoying when you're trying to work on a book. And yeah, yeah, I guess I haven't talked yet about leather, so I'll just do a quick little talk about leather. Um, for this demo, I have three kinds of leather that I'll be tooling on. This here is a leather plaquette, which I made from a skin of Harmattan goat skin that was split to around 0.7. In general, full thickness leather is around a millimeter thick. And you will there's a noticeable difference when you're tooling on something that is 1 millimeter thick versus something that's like 0.7 or even less. So you're going to be able to get a crisper impression with your thinner leather, but you are sacrificing strength as you're doing that. And you can do other things to leather. This leather, I crushed and polished a little bit. You can see it's a very flat surface, or at least I hope you can see, very smooth. For this book, the black leather here is the Moroccan half grain goat skin that Talus has, which I know Relma has as well. And then this orange leather on the bottom here is the French shagreen, which Talus also carries. These are from the same tannery. One is just more heavily grained, and the other is a little bit more like pebble grained and more uniform in its grain. You can polish your leather, or you can leave it as is. That's going to be a design decision that you're going to want to do. I know polishing your leather has fallen out of favor. However, if you're doing a binding that's going to be covered in gold tooling, having a nice polished kind of crushed leather surface will give you a bit easier time, and the results will be a little bit better. That's just because as you make your impression, you're able to put down more pressure without having the leather go deeper. Because when you're doing your impressions, when you're making, you want to make sure that the impressions aren't too deep, because light has to come in, hit the gold, and then leave, and then that catches your eye. So ultimately, if you have a leather that is thicker, like especially thick, and your impression is really deep, you can actually get to a place where you ultimately don't end up seeing much of the impression. Robin asks, how do you polish your leather? There are a couple different ways. Because all of my boards that I do for my design bindings and fine bindings are shaped, I sand them so that you have just a real subtle board shaping, like this. I don't crush it in a press. That's one thing that you can do if you're working on a flat surface. You can put it between either acrylic boards or metal plates and crush it. For me, I use polishing irons. Here are the main two that I have. The barrel polishing iron, which is great for flat surfaces. And then this this one is more so for spines or for smaller, this is the one that I used on this little book. I wouldn't necessarily want to try and polish it with with this, given that that's longer in both dimensions, height and width. So you start off polishing with a heated polishing iron through paper. You can use craft paper, you can use Mohawk, whatever text weight paper you have. And then ultimately you kind of go in here. There we go. And having a support underneath it, I'll bring my finisher's box over shortly. And you work on it in circular motions, making sure that you're not stopping in some places, making sure that you're not stuffing the leather. And you also need to be careful, especially on lighter skinned leathers, that you don't wring out color where you don't want it to be. So that's something to keep in mind. Um, let's see, this question, would designing a template be done with tool and ink if you had something like a free-handed curve, or would you be more likely to use the paper like tracing paper? Yeah, if I had something a little bit more freehand looking, I would still probably do the same process on the same paper. Um, Building up that kind of, if you're building up complex curves, um, I still do the same thing. This other binding that I'm working on here has got a lot of complex curves, and while they don't necessarily have a free-handed look to them, they're still built up of multiple individual pieces of line or gouges. Here's a gouge. A gouge is just a curved tool that you use to make curved lines. And so, especially with something like this, Art Nouveau curves are really complicated. But yeah, I would still use the same technique, the same process of making my design. Um, so yeah, so when it comes to leather, again, as you're doing a binding, you're going to want to make up a plaquette, especially if it's with a leather that you haven't used before. If I'm using a harmattan skin, I'm generally not necessarily needing to do a plaquette of it first to see how it tools. But there are different things between each skin that maybe one particular skin will discolor in a particular way. And maybe, that's something that you would find out if you did a plaquette beforehand. Depending on the binding for me, if it's a complicated design, I may try it out on a plaquette first. You can also use like blotter paper to try things out on to make sure that your curves are going to flow well. Or if you want to get used to your design, the binding that I showed in my slideshow, this guy. I did all the tooling on this in one day. It was a long day, but I did it in one day. However, that's not quite true. Oops, there we go, this way. Because the day before, I made up a number of pieces of blotter, and I did this design over and over until I knew where every tool was going to go. So that when I did it with egg glare, there was just no stopping. I just went right through and did the entire board. Okay, so blind tooling is going to be the basis for our gilding process. Ultimately, what you want with your blind tooling are crisp impressions that have a polished bottom of the impression. Hopefully this is catching a little bit on there. Ultimately, what that's going to allow you to do, and especially again with the shellac glare, I'll do my blind tooling on one day, and then I won't gild it to the next day because I want the leather to dry overnight. And that makes it a lot easier when we're going back into that impression with gold. So just because I didn't want to have it take a whole lot of extra time, I did go ahead and cut some windows in this template. If you'll notice the template that I initially used on the book, this one has got a lot more tape on it because I was also using this tool here. As I demo, I'm not going to use this little tool here. It's a complicated tool, and I don't think that we're necessarily going to gain a lot of insight about blind tooling with a decorative tool when I have a different decorative tool that I'm going to be demonstrating, and that is this kind of triangle tool that I made. Now, again, there are all of these little windows. with something like this, with lines and impressions that go off the board, you don't want to put tape on where your lines are, where your tooling is going to be, because you're going to impress through that and then probably leave some residue. So that's something that, like, as you can see up here, I have all of these little pieces of tape on a design that doesn't go all the way over the edge. I would simply tape all the way around. So here, I've already cut my windows and ready to put it onto my book. Right. This is my finisher's box. Absolutely wonderful piece of equipment. It's effectively a box with 3 sides, one side open, and this inner spot here is beveled. And that way you can put a book in here where you have the cover on top, and then the book is sitting underneath, supported by this linen band, and some etching blankets down in there as well. This is initially, I saw Michael Wilcox use one of these in his Bookbinding 2000 video. And then I saw one of these at Karen Hanmer's that Jana Pullman had come up with this great metal top, wood top idea. I've seen metal top ones. I tried making a metal top one once, and I chose the wrong metal for it, and it just bent and bowed. But I've had this for about 10 years, and it works great. It took me less than a day to make it. So here I am. I'm going to line up my template on my plaquette. A lot of the times what I'll do is I will make sure that the design, that my template that I'm taping on is like a millimeter shorter, both height and width, so that I can see a little bit of the edge of the board. What that also lets you do and make sure is that if the paper does go exactly to the edge, sometimes if it's even a half millimeter more, then it'll want to like pull the paper around with it. And that can sometimes disturb your design. So I'm going to, I know I already have the little windows cut out and all of that, but I still am going to tape this all the way around to make sure that it won't move. I am going to have to do a little finicky cutting right now, real quick, just to make sure that I also have a little bit of tape at the top and bottom. I'll show you what I mean. So here between, that's actually way longer than I need. Okay. Lane says, how do you use the holes you punch in the template? Do you mean how do I punch the holes in the template, or what is their purpose? Not entirely sure. I use a Japanese screw punch. It works great. I've got the little 5mm guy, and doing 2 or 3 of those beside each other generally gives you enough space to both have your hole in the template, have tape on either side, and then have that be able to stick down to the leather. And then Elizabeth asked, does the tape not interfere with your make ready evenness? I'm not. Can you say what you mean by make ready evenness?
Yes, just curious about if it creates sort of an uneven surface when you're wrapping the tape around the backside.
Oh, gotcha. No, not really. It's fairly thin, and it tends to not have any negative effects on what's going on. I should also say though that if you're working with calf, you do not want to tape on the surface of the calf because what will happen is when you take the tape off, it'll take some of the grain layer with it, and you'll end up with something that doesn't look quite good. And so for something like that, for if you're binding in veg tan calf and you're using a template, one thing you can do is you can put like little dabs of paste around the corners, around the edges, or you can make a template that goes longer and wider, wrap those flanges around and tape them to the inside of the board. And that's one way to kind of get around that particular what was the Morris quote? The special limitations of the material, um, which he says should be a good thing and not a hindrance. So here we go. This is all taped on. Yeah, what kind of tape am I using? I'm just using Scotch tape, just the magic tape. Um, I know the kind of damage that can be done with this tape, uh, especially if it's on something for a long time. Luckily, this is going to be on here for not very long. I've never had any sort of interaction on any of the surface of my leather or any lingering residue or anything. So that's not something that I've had any problems or issues with. Um, Now, one thing I'll say about this design, there are a couple of interesting and fun things that I'll be doing with regards to the design on this. So my design, I've got these four parallel lines running at a slight angle, and there are a couple ways you can do something like that. For me, for this one, I'm using a line tool that has four parallel lines. And then what I'm going to do is go back in them with a single line tool. Now, the reasoning for that is that when you go into an impression with a tool like this, you're going to be rocking the tool slightly back and forth. And these middle two lines aren't quite going to get as much pressure. And especially when you're gilding, you need to have proper contact and proper pressure between the tool and the leather. So while this can definitely gild four lines on its own, it'll have a nicer and better effect if I go back in and continue on with this single line tool, which, one of the things that I really wanted to make sure that I was doing was line work, because in my opinion, line work just with a straight line is one of the most versatile kinds of book design that you can do. You can do anything from something historical, you can do modern work, you can do contemporary, and I thought I had a book nearby that I can show that has that in it, but for whatever reason, it's not in its box. So if I can pick it out, I may end up sorting it out. But for now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to blind in with this four line tool through the template as my first steps of tooling. Now I am going to tool with the heated tool through that. All right. Approach wise, when you're standing or sitting, or when you're doing your work, when you're doing your finishing. And I fall into the English style of finishing and sighting, which means that as I'm doing this, I'm going to have my body over the tool, and that'll allow me to use my body weight to make my impression, which is significant for me because I want to make sure that I can do this as long as I possibly can, and as healthily as I possibly can. And to me, the longevity of my career is very important. And so for me, tooling this way makes more sense. It's not going to give you a better impression than if you tool a different way. You can tool sitting down. That is one way to do it, where you generally, if you're doing a line, you're going across like this. For me, this right here, you can kind of put some of your body weight into it, but it is putting a lot of strain on your wrist here. And that's something that, obviously as I'm tooling, I'm doing stretches. I'm making sure that my body is in a decent enough position. And posture and stance is something that is integral to my style of tooling. I have my hips square to the edge of the bench. I have here a little cutting mat with grid lines on it. So effectively what I'm going to be doing, everything I do is going to be perpendicular to the edge of the bench. So you have reference points. I have the edge of the bench. I have the sides of the bench. I have all the grid lines on my cutting mat. I have that side of my bench. And I'm going to use that to make sure that when I make each impression, I have the same stance, I have the same approach. And that, to me, is a way to make things a little bit more consistent and easier as you're moving along. I would say, being able to just take a straight line tool and do a straight line perpendicular from where you're sitting on the bench is something to work towards. And for me, this approach of hips square to the bench, working perpendicular when you're doing line work, and the same thing when you're using a decorative tool, is I will move the book, I will move the object that I'm using rather than tilting my body 10 degrees this way or 4 degrees this way or anything like that. Just kind of coming at it with a very kind of strict, straightforward approach. So as you tool first through your template, you want to hot tool because you want to get enough definition in there to be able to, after you take the template off, to go back into that impression. Now, because this tool has a large surface area, I'm going to need to use a lot more pressure than a tool that doesn't. As I start my line, I have a loose grip on my tool, and I guide my tool into place with my thumb here. And you can use a little leather thimble, or you can get a set of leather gloves from a thrift store, cut the thumb off and use that here. Nowadays, I just use my thumb. I prefer it because it can tell me whether or not my tool is too hot. So as I'm tooling this set of lines, the majority of the pressure that I'm putting is in the middle of the tool here. This has a shallow curve to it, which is wonderful because that allows you to focus the pressure where you're going, as opposed to a flat face tool, which you're not going to get a proper line out of, because if it is, at least on a flat surface, because if it is a completely flat face tool, when you rock it back and forth and then this way, here you're just digging into these corners. Whereas with a curved tool, when you rock it this way, you're able to get the same kind of pressure that you got here at the back and at the front. So these flat face tools are great for spine work where you're already doing a curved surface. So doing a flat palette on a curved surface is going to work a little bit better than using a curved palette on a curved surface, because you kind of have these two curves that kind of work against each other. You're fine to do it, absolutely. It's just a little bit easier with a flat face tool. Also, if you have any jewelry or whatever, when you're working with leather, especially when you're working with leather that you're going to dampen out, have no jewelry on. It can be devastating to do all of the work that you do on a binding just to make an impression in the leather that you then have to sort out or fix or do an on layover or an inlay or any sort of possible mistake type thing. So as I was saying before, heat it, cool it, polish it. One thing I'll say about the layout of my bench is everything is put in a way where I'm not doing unnecessary movements. So I'm right-handed, so I have my stove here, my cooling pad here, my polishing pad here, and then my book right here. I'm not crossing my body. I'm not doing anything other than heat it, cool it, polish it, and then go into my impression. Now, I won't do it on here, but one thing that can be really helpful when you have a complicated template, or you have a piece of line that only goes so far, what can be really nice is to simply use a bone folder or a brass folder, find your line and score it through the paper. Because this has 4 lines in a row and I can simply just use my this palette, I'm not going to do that here. But that is something that I'll often do. Instead of tooling through my template, I will often just use if it's a straight line, use either a bone folder or a brass folder and score my line in. So if you'll notice, every time I go into an impression, I'm starting from the back, I'm going to the front. I'm rocking from the back of the tool to the front. That is every single time. So I'm not trying to rock it forward and then think, oh, did I quite get enough pressure? Let me rock it back. It's so easy to just go off of your line and rock it back, and you end up with a double impression, which will cause a lot of frustration. And so starting here and here, what I'm doing is I'm really only advancing the tool about a third of the way. When you have a continuous line like this, you can use the previous parts of the impression as a jig to keep you in your line. And as I'm doing it, I am also rocking slightly side to side as I go from back to front. And what that does is it crisps up the bottom corners of the impression. Where's my paper? So if this is my impression here, a cross section, when you rock it from side to side, you're making sure that those two bottom sides of the impression are getting enough pressure and will give you a crisp impression. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and do my decorative tool, this one little triangle tool. So this is the first stage of blind tooling, either tooling through a template with a heated tool or marking up with a bone folder directly on the leather. Maybe I'll do one of those just to show you after I take off this template. One thing too, if you'll notice, as I have my tool on the stove, it is so tempting to put pressure down on it to try and make it heat up faster. But when you do that, you're just putting a lot of strain on your wrists. And so I really just kind of let it sit there on the stove like this. And it'll heat up. When I make my tools, I generally add a little bit more mass to them than others, which means it'll take a little bit longer to heat up, but the tool will keep the heat for much longer. And if anyone saw Brian Beidler's standards presentation, I had heard that bronze does hold heat better than brass. But he went through and found out that actually, in terms of like heat retention, ultimately, if you were able to do 10 impressions with a brass tool at a certain heat, you could maybe do 11 of them in bronze. So while it does retain heat a little bit more, it's not that much. And then, of course, over here on the stove aspect, the more area that you have in contact, the more surface area in contact between the tool and the stove, the quicker it'll heat up. This is why I like square shanks on my tools. For some tools, you may need to put either like just like a little piece of brass onto the stove. If you've got a tool like this that's got a shank that is smaller on all sides, you can use either a piece of brass to put on the stove and heat it up that way. You can also get one of these nice little brass roll rests, which are great for heating up a roll, but they also work real well heating up using the shank of a tool that's got a larger face. Florian asks, why don't I use an electrically heated tool holder? So there are some tool holders that you can effectively, there's a heating mechanism and then there's a power cord that runs from it to whatever the power source is. The main reason for me is it's just not there's no economy of time with something like that. If I were doing one, like a straight line tool, and that was the only thing I was doing on the binding, I could see that works. But for the most part, the designs that I do are going to have multiple tools on them, and sitting there and like swapping out the faces of the tool, to me just isn't the kind of efficiency that I would want with my tooling. And you also have the cord and all of that. So that's why a nice little hot plate works real well. So as I'm doing this decorative tool, let me say a little bit more about what I'm doing. Again, I've got my hips square to the edge of my bench. Here, I've got it so that the back of the tool is parallel with the edge of the bench, and the point of this triangle is perpendicular to what I'm doing. Now, with a decorative tool, a tool like this, that's effectively a square. With a decorative tool like this, you want to rock it to the sides like this and not to the diagonals. Because what will happen is if you rock it to the diagonals, those points will be much deeper than the rest of the tool. But when you rock it to a full side like this, you can end up with your impression that's done where it is effectively even all over. Now with a tool like this, with a triangle, instead of rocking it in 4 directions, because this last direction here would just dig into your leather, I'm rocking it back to all of the sides. So this rocking it up to this angle, and then this angle, and then this angle. And that will give me a properly even impression. As you're doing your design, especially if it's a complicated design, you want to know where you're at. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll just use like a colored pencil and just mark off very softly, right? Because you can make an impression into leather, but you can use just like a colored pencil or something to mark on there, letting yourself know that you already did something. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're not having distractions as you're tooling, as you're going through your tooling sessions. But inevitably, you will lose your place at some point on some book. And it's nice to have a little bit of reinforcement, so you're not just relying on your memory. So with that all out of the way, I tooled in my lines and my little triangle tool. Carefully removing the tape. If you take it off too quickly, you can take some of the grain layer with you, which looks really bad. How does the tool rocking motion work with asymmetrical designs is the question. It's the same. I mean, there are definitely going to be instances like if there are just sharp points all around, then you just have to do your best to get an even impression. But that's just something that, as you're using each individual tool, such as this one, which is fairly asymmetrical, making sure that you get the proper pressure and also trying it out on a plaquette beforehand will definitely help you make sure that you can tell, that you can see whether or not you're making an impression where you don't want to be. Oh yeah, and I did want to add in a line in here just to show, I mean, if what you're doing is just trying to do a frame around what you're doing, you can find your way that's parallel to the board edge, and then with a backwards to front motion here, you can go in and score your line. So here, over here is the line that I just scored, and then here we have those sets of 4 lines and these triangles that I tooled. So that is the first stage of blind tooling, which is either marking up or, I can do a cool tool on dry leather for this guy that was just scored in. Okay, so first stage of blind tooling is done. you always want to remember which way you were tooling, especially with a tool, such as this with 4 lines. They might look identical and perfectly spaced between each other, but they might not be. So you want to make sure that you know which way you were tooling. And the same goes for just a single straight line, right? Here we have a straight line, but the tool on this side is perfectly flat, whereas this side is beveled. So if you're going into the impression the other way around, the tool isn't going to be working the exact same. And so that's one reason why what you want to be doing is making sure you know which way the tool is facing as you're tooling through it. Now, in general, as you go through, Robin's asking about my modified vernier caliper. There we go. Yeah, this is a modified vernier caliper based on a tool that I saw when I was studying with Luigi Castiglione in Italy. So a vernier caliper, let's see if I have one that I haven't modified yet, will oftentimes look like this. And this is for measuring inside and outside, but adding a little bit of thickness on the back here, making sure that these two things here are perfectly parallel and perfectly, ultimately, I use my belt sander to get these to be absolutely in alignment. You can figure out how far you want whatever it is to be from the board edge. And effectively, you use this little step here against the board edge. And then you can simply check from the front, the back, and then the back, the back, the front, the back again. And then whatever you do here is going to be perfectly parallel with the board edge. Absolute phenomenal tool. It helps too if your board shear is square, so that everything that's at the board edge is going to be square with the rest of the book. But yeah, that's a wonderful little tool that I use multiple times on every binding I do. So the second stage of blind tooling is a heated tool on dry leather. Now, I'll also say that as somebody who is fairly confident in my finishing skills, I will definitely skip stages of tooling. Ultimately, what you want is to have an impression that has been made and brought up through tooling with a heated tool on dampened leather. If you feel like you want to freehand your entire design, which I wouldn't suggest, but you can. When I'm doing this, I'm not blocking the view for you guys. I'm blocking the light coming here so I can see my impression. Oftentimes, the absence of light can be just as helpful as the presence of it. And again, this tool has a very large face, so I have to use a lot of pressure. It probably looks like I'm using a lot of pressure. I'm putting both of my hands on it and bearing down. One thing that should be noted, and one thing that helped me a lot when I was first tooling, was I was doing a lot of tooling where I was kind of coming in at a shallow angle like this, right? Now, if you do that, you're going to end up with an impression that's deeper on one side than the other. And my first tooling class that I took with Dominic Riley, he told me, like, actually just put your put your chin right above your thumb, and that'll kind of force you to correct going like this to going like this. Now, you will sometimes have tools like this one, which I don't know if you can see it, but the tool handle goes one way and then the tool kind of goes off in another direction. That's something that you need to be aware of as you're making your impression, to make sure that you are getting an even impression on all sides. But in general, if you're getting new tools, they're probably going to be doing just okay. As that tool's heating up, this is where we're at right now. I've firmed up the impressions a little bit on these, but I am going to give them one more pass. And one of the reasons that we do the stages of tooling the way that we do is so that at each step, at each point, you can look at your tooling, you can look at the placement of your tools, of your design, all of that, and you can correct an issue if it happens to turn up. I don't think I have any issues currently. We'll see if I end up demonstrating that. There is a section in my handout about fixing mistakes, which can be helpful. A lot of the times in my 5-day workshop, I'll wait until Friday to show how to correct things, because it is much, much more important that you spend time practicing so that you get it right the first time, or at least closer to being right the first time. Here, this one I actually haven't done with a hot tool on dry leather yet. And just making sure I find myself in there and rock my tool. And again, as I'm doing this, I'm still only advancing the tool a little bit every time. It's something like maybe a third of the tool, maybe a quarter of the tool moving forward, using the previous line that I just tooled to move forward with. I'm going to go ahead and tool these little triangles. It's a slow process moving forward, but it really does allow you to focus in and get your impressions, get your design to be exactly where you want it to be. Yeah, we've got a question about using a roll. Sure. Rolls are fun, and you can do some interesting and fun things with them. And it is faster than using a small line palette. The reason that I teach with a line palette, first and foremost, is, and especially one that's only 2 inches long, is because it's easier to control than a fillet or a wheel, or even a little bit easier to control than something that has a more curved face to it. Just a nice kind of shallow face like this. You can get really accurate with rolls. You can also do curves with them. The problem or the difficulty runs in kind of building up this set of skills, which is totally, absolutely doable. But when I teach my workshops, I generally teach with this. They are a little bit cheaper, and you can get really accurate with them. I've heard of stories where somebody takes an apprenticeship doing finishing, and they spend every day for at least a month just doing rolls on leather until you can get it so that it's perfectly straight every time. You can definitely do that. But in terms of what I find to be especially helpful for folks starting out, using just a normal line palette over a roll, there are also what's decorative rolls where you have various designs engraved onto a roll of brass. These, I generally only use these with egg glare, because it's really difficult to go back into an impression with a roll like this. There is just a lot of detail on all of this. It can be done. I've seen it done going back into an impression built up with the roll. But if I'm using a roll, chances are I'm using egg glare and just doing, with egg glare and rolls, you generally just have like one shot to get it right. But using egg glare allows you to have that moisture present, so you have that heat and moisture contact to make it a proper and good and full impression. But for me, the barrier for entry with a line palette like this, you can get one. You can get a line palette for, I guess it depends on where you're getting it from. And I will be hopefully working with Brian Beidler this upcoming year to kind of design what I think is like, the ideal palette, and especially for my purposes. And hopefully, and I know he's going to be working on casting, and that's going to help things move along. Because I really want to have something available. Something available for folks to be able to get fairly easily and try and keep it on the more economical side. Anyways. Do I prefer hard or soft cardboard under the leather? I tend to, the binders board that I use is fairly dense. I use the green mill board for the most part. There is a layer of paper on top of that, and then the leather. But if we still had the leather, the board that they had back in, turn of the century, that rope board that was like ridiculously dense and hard, I would absolutely love to use that. Makes such a satisfying thud. But also, when it comes to tooling, when you make an impression, you're not just making an impression into the leather, you're making an impression into the leather and everything underneath it. A softer board will accept some of that pressure, and a harder board will cause some resistance. Now, the resistance is going to give you a little bit more detail in your impression. One thing should be said is, like, if you're doing historical work, you may not want a super dense and sturdy board. You may want something a little bit softer, so it'll really take the impression. It'll be really kind of much deeper and give a little bit more of an older feel to it, depending on when and where the book is from and all of that. But yeah, I do prefer as dense of a board as I can get, and unfortunately, I don't have a standing press with with a huge iron bar to really compress things. But yeah, my board structure is usually 2 layers of that mill board with a sheet of paper in between, and then a couple of board linings on the inside and one on the outside. So here's where I'm at now. You can kind of see, I mean, especially on these triangles, you can see that the bottom of the impression is very reflected, which is what you want. That is exactly what you're going for. However, during this next step, we're going to lose some of that definition, and then we will, by adding moisture, by adding water to this, the impressions are going to plump up a little bit as the leather accepts and absorbs the moisture, and then as we tool over it again, we are especially going to lower our pressure, because as the leather is more fragile, because it's got moisture, it's going to take an impression a little bit more. Richard Minsky says, Davey made the gold label rope board until the 80s. The last time he got it required half a ton minimum order. Those order minimums can be pretty brutal. So here's this straight line here. Again, as always, hip square to the bench. I'm working perpendicular to the bench. Heat the tool it, polish it on the plane suede. Loose grip until I find myself in my impression. Then firm my grip up. And I'm rocking from back to front, or advancing from back to front and rocking slightly side to side. So here's that now that it's been impressed on. And then I think what I'm just going to do is I'm going to ignore these 2 outer quad lines and just do these ones in the middle. I'm not sure that doing 4 rather than 2 is going to really change the efficacy of my demo. So I always use distilled water when it comes to adding moisture to my leather. I just have a bottle nearby, and you can use a sponge as long as it's clean. You can also use cotton balls; those work great too. For some tools, especially if it's a flat tool, if you have a flat face tool that you're tooling onto a flat surface, to kind of get a little bit more detail in the center, what you can do is take either a brush or a water brush, and then just kind of paint in some water into the inner part of that impression. And that will kind of allow you to go back into that impression, get a little bit more definition in the middle, and then you can dampen the whole thing out and tool it again, and you'll still retain that definition. So now that I've added water, the leather is starting to plump back out. So it's a little bit more difficult to see exactly where my impression is. And frankly, I didn't get these super deep prior to this. So just want to make sure that I'm not going off my line. There we go. good measure, I will do this once more. And you can go over an impression as many times as you need to make sure that it has the crispness and definition that you need. And I will oftentimes just kind of locally add water, and it's not much. This leather is really soaking in the moisture. It looks like I added a lot more moisture than I actually did. And a lot of the times when you're doing this, you want to kind of add the moisture and then wait for the surface, for the moisture on the surface to dissipate. So Graham asks, what do you accomplish by gently pressing the heel of your hand into the dampened leather? So that kind of both works the moisture into the leather, but also wicks some of it away. So that can kind of help move the process along. I never use any kind of blow dryer or anything like that to help speed up the drying process. I won't ever take my book and put it over my stove to try and dry it out quicker. You really just want to work with the material as you can, and as natural as you can. There's a question about lighting, which is fairly significant as well. So let me dampen out these little triangles, and I will talk about lighting. Or actually, that was the next one. So as this is kind of drying out a little bit, I've got a backlight here. You can kind of see this bar right here. I am in a garden unit, which means I don't get as much light as a normal, first or second or whatever floor apartment. I get enough. I get some, but then I have a stronger task light on my left, right? And I'm right-handed. So as I'm sighting a line tool, I've got the flat side of the tool on its left side. And so the light that has a little bit more power kind of comes in and shows me what's going on from that side. And then I have another task light on my right that's just a little weaker, not quite as bright. And that tends to give me what I need. You can also reposition your lights so you have either raking light or, basically you want to be able to see what you're going into, especially at this stage of the impression. Eventually you're going to get to the spot where it doesn't matter what the lighting is, because you can just feel your way into your impression and move along as needed. But especially this step here, this and the next step are the most critical in getting the depth of impression that you want. And the depth of impression that you're going for is going to be much shallower than you think. One exercise that I have students do is to do 4 lines in succession, going from as deep as they possibly can, and then letting up on the pressure each successive line. And inevitably, whenever somebody comes up and shows me okay, this is what I did, which one is what I'm going for, it's always the lightest one. And again, that's the reasoning behind that is you don't want too deep of an impression that the light ends up getting lost. when I have a tool like this, as you can probably see, I check to see the placement of the back of the tool before I make my impression. And that's because I want the back of this tool to share space with the line that I tooled. And so I just want to be able to see that. Because having two impressions meet can be difficult, but once you get used to making sure you're getting the right amount of pressure on each spot on the tool, you're going to be able to. Sorry, that was supposed to go on the stove. You're going to be able to kind of move forward and make those impressions. So yeah, this is the third stage of blind tooling, which is a cool tool on dampened leather. I am getting some color coming out of the leather. And I don't necessarily need both hands on the tool for these impressions. Cool. So what I'm going to do now is the final stage of blind tooling. I am going to be switching over to my single line palette to get all of these 4 lines to be where they need to be. Oftentimes at this stage, you don't necessarily have to dampen out again. I am, because I've been talking, and as I talk more and more water and moisture dissipates. So just kind of giving a little re-up on the water there. And on the handout that I have, the top sheet of it has all of the stages from blind tooling through a template through the final stage of burnishing your gold in the impression. And that's so you can just kind of have that on your bench with the top sheet on top and have an easy reference and not have to worry about flipping through it every time. And again, here I'm just kind of wicking away some of the excess moisture, as well as pushing some of the moisture in. And I'm especially focusing on the spots that seem to have more moisture than others. Now, when you're doing blind tooling, you want to be careful if you're going to slide the tool. A lot of old finishing books, especially when they're talking about doing a fillet, will talk about like shoving a wedge into it so that it doesn't roll, and then you glide across to burnish and polish to the bottom of the impression, which is wonderful. But you really have to make sure that you know you're in that impression. So I generally advocate for and ask folks to, instead of sliding the tool, to just lift up so there's no pressure, advance it, and then put down your pressure. And this is, again, the pressure from the tool is going from back to front, and I am rocking the tool side to side. Now, the heat of the tool at this stage is well below a sizzle, but hot enough to give the definition that you need, right? If you do and if you're doing blind tooling on leather that has more kind of rocky, more prominent grain, you may have to go slightly deeper to be able to get the definition that you need. But you want to make sure that you're not going too deep that you just completely lose the gold. And yeah, you can do multiple lines with one heating up of the tool. It's just going to depend on how quickly you're moving and how long the lines are. Obviously, this is about 3 inches tall, so my lines are very short. It's easy to get more from each one. So these now have the definition in them that I'm looking for, and I'm about to tool these triangles real quick, at which point we will move on to gold. Well, prepping for gold and then to gold. It doesn't have to be at a sizzle. It can be below a sizzle. And at this stage, if you need to go over an impression multiple times, you can. But you want to make sure the end result is a nice, polished impression for the gold to sit on. So, glaring in, I'm going to be using a rapidograph pen. This was something that I saw Stuart Brockman using, and it is wonderful for synthetic glare. So this is the kind of basic construction of a rapidograph pen. You've got a little collar here, the reservoir. Down here you have the nib. If you further take it apart, you can take the nib out of its little holder, right? And then we have this little plastic cap back here, which keeps this needle part of the nib in. Every once in a while, if the nib does get clogged, what I'll do is I'll take this needle out, thread it through the other way, and just try and dislodge anything that might be in there. And you can also take it out and flush it completely. But if you just need a little bit more use out of your pen, you can do that. And then at the end of the day, you can flush it either with water or with a water and isopropyl alcohol solution. And then you just put it all back together and go on and glare in. I'm not going to glare in this entire thing because I already have the next stage prepped and glared. But I do want to show a little bit of the process of it. Cool. So you can use a fine watercolor brush. For me, I prefer this. It's very easy to stay within your line. And apply glare. Ultimately, we're going to do 2 coats of this. This is a synthetic shellac glare that I made myself. I have my recipe in the handout, but I also recently did a little Instagram video where I made my glare. So if you're interested in how you can do that yourself, I do have a video of it posted on Instagram. There we go. I've done these 4 lines already. I'm going to do some of these triangles, and then I'll go back and do those lines again. You know, it really doesn't need anything more than like 10 minutes for the most part to dry, or even less than that. You want to move fairly slowly and deliberately. If you work too fast, then you're not necessarily going to be getting as much glare in there as you need. So you may end up having to go back and do a third coat. So going much slower than you think you need to is going to get you the best coverage. I'm going to call all of those triangles as completed and go back and put my second coat of glare for the purposes of our demonstration. You will get glare on the walls of the impression, but not much. And as we're gilding, we're going to use a short, sharp, and confident impression to make sure that we don't get a bunch of extra gold on the walls of the impression. That can be very annoying to clean out. So that's the process of glaring in. What size nib am I using? So I use either a number 1 or a number 2. I use the number 1 more than I use the number 2 size nib. It's a 0.50, but then there's also the 0.60. The 0.50 clogs a bit more. The 0.60 runs a little bit more fluidly. This one, the 0.50, I use for my binder's signature, which is, I think those letters are less than 2 millimeters tall or something around that. So you can really, this can really do what you need it to. This is especially good for wider lines where you need a little bit more glare in there. This is also pretty good for like large areas that need to be filled, such as these triangles. The reason I haven't been using it on these triangles is because it's kind of hard to get the absolute tip of it because of the shape of the triangle that I made. But that kind of gets you there. So here we can see this finisher's box in action. We've got this board right there. We've got our linen strap to support it. And then now I can spin this, move this however I want. The book is here and it's got a great support underneath it. Moving on to gold. Gold is a fun material. I am going to build this up. Set this aside for now. So here I have, I thought I had at least one clean side, but close enough. So your gold cushion is suede. So you take a piece of plywood or some sort of wood, just to stay on the topic, Do I ever use Fixor for glare? I've used it. I used it when I was at school a little bit because that's what Jeff taught us. But then I primarily used egg glare. And then as far as I'm pretty sure that Fixor either isn't being made anymore or it's not necessarily the same as it used to be. I can't quite remember, but I know that there are a number of Fixor users have swapped now to this shellac glare. So yeah, it's fine. It works as far as I know. It works the exact same. I haven't run it through a rapidograph pen, but as far as I know, it's allegedly a shellac-based adhesive. I know there's some doubt whether or not it is actually shellac, but it functions as the same as shellac glare. But yeah, so you take about a centimeter thick stack of paper, put it on top of the plywood being just a little bit wider and taller in both directions. And then you wrap it in suede, and then you want to put some pumice powder on it so that the gold doesn't stick to it. You want to make real sure that you're not introducing any oil to this entire setup, because if you get oil on your gold cushion or on your gold knife, you're going to end up losing your gold. So what I'm using here is Manetti Ducati Double Gold, 23.5 carats. I don't use anything lower than 22 carats unless I'm using it intentionally, because it will end up tarnishing if it goes kind of 21 and lower. Now you can do some cool stuff where you have areas of gilding that tarnishes and areas of gilding that doesn't, but that's a design decision and has nothing to do with the technique that we're covering here. To get a piece of gold from the booklet onto your cushion, you open up to a new leaf. Sorry, the angle's a little weird. Then tap your knife in front and blow the gold over. Then you turn your knife vertical and lift up so you can take the gold. And then here, what you're going to do is you're going to close your book before you put the gold down, because if you put your gold down and then close your book, you may add a gust of wind that'll send the gold flying. From this position, you're going to make a puh sound from straight above it. And that's going to flatten it out. That doesn't work like that all the time. Luckily for me, it did. And then I'm just going to cut my gold. Now I'm cutting this gold slightly larger than the face of the tool. I already have some gold that I cut for lines, but maintaining your gold knife is important, especially making sure that it's sharp. As you can see here, I'm cutting through, it's not dragging on anything. That's what you're going for. Over here, I've already cut some for the line work, which is what I'm going to gild with first. So I will come back and probably do another sheet of gold that I cut into lines. And if you'll notice, I am putting my gold into a place where it is still on my right side. I'm not crossing my body. I'm not doing any sort of motions that would, possibly, cross my body or just making sure I'm not doing any motions that don't need to be done. Setting this up so that all of these straight lines are perpendicular to the edge of the bench, hip square to the edge of the bench, heat your tool, cool it, polish it, and yeah. Before I move on from that, how do I sharpen my gold knife, and how sharp should it be? I generally sharpen mine on a slack belt. I've got, well, the one that I was using today, it's like a 1x18 little mini grinder. And so the belt spins around and you just hold this and drag it across. And I do support the tip. I'm not going to touch it now because I don't want to introduce any oil to my gold knife, but you do that and you can kind of draw it across. You can also use either sandpaper or micro finishing film, something like that. But ultimately you want it to be sharp enough to easily cut the gold, but not so sharp that it cuts into your gold cushion. So the edge geometry that I particularly like for a gold knife is I think it's Appleseed edge type, where the edge comes down like that to a straight point here. This is especially good. This is a grind that is often used on like axes or things that want a little bit more support behind the edge. But the reason that I like it here for a gold knife is because it is sharp here, but it won't go too deep because there is all of this mass here that's supporting the edge. And then, of course, after you do that, you take some lighter fluid and some cotton balls and wipe down your gold knife, get any grease off of it before moving on. So when we're tooling, this way that I tool, I'm going to pick up 2 or 3 layers of gold onto my tool, onto the face of the tool. And the way that you do that is, as I said, gold doesn't necessarily like Vaseline, but Vaseline likes gold. So what I'll do is, and I won't actually use this for my line tool. For my line tool, I'll use my polishing pad. This side here has got Vaseline rubbed into it. So heat it, cool it, polish it, and I'm polishing it here on the middle. And then you get a little bit of Vaseline on the face of the tool and on the flat side of the tool. And that's going to allow you to pick up 2 layers of gold, which is going to look like this. As I'm handling the gold, I'll actually move the camera over there to catch it. And then you use a cotton pad, and you can just push the gold up against the side of the tool, and that allows you to see down the side. You don't necessarily need to have sight lines. You can actually do all of this by touch, but it is nice to be able to see a little bit. So what I'm doing here is, just as before, I'm putting pressure from the back to the front of the tool, and then rocking it side to side, and it is a very short dwell time. So, in and out. In and out. The longer you stay in the impression, the more likely you are to get gold on the walls of the impression, which then you will have to go back in and clean off, which is a really annoying. So here's this gold on my gold cushion here. I don't particularly care how nice it looks in terms of like organization. Sometimes you'll just get leaves of gold that don't want to behave. Sometimes you'll have gold come with you that you don't necessarily want. But ultimately, you're picking up 2 layers of gold on the face of this tool. And I'll do 3 for a decorative tool. But for a line, I can just do 2, and here I'm going to overlap by a couple millimeters my previous line. But because you can fold the gold over and tool it again, you don't need as many layers. So ultimately, we've got several layers of gold in each impression. And then I go in. This here is a fine cheesecloth. The brand that I use is Regency. I think I got it at Whole Foods the first time I found them, and then I just get them off of Amazon. So tooling back, heat it, cool it, polish it, pick up 2 layers of gold, loose grip till I find myself in my impression. I didn't actually clear my sight line there, the step where you push the gold up against the flat side of your tool. Because I know that I don't need to see what I'm doing, I don't always clear my sight lines. It's all, at a certain point, the touch that you have in your hand will allow you to work without needing to see what you're doing. But it also can be nice to see what you're doing when you're working with a tool that's perhaps a little bit more difficult than a line, or maybe it's your first time using a particular tool. And so you want to have a good eye on everything that's going on. So you just clear your sight line like that. And for the most part, gold waste in this technique is quite minimal. I mean, I'm literally just folding it over and tooling it into the impression again. Do I ever use a gold rubber to capture the excess gold? I do. Generally not with this technique, because there's so little excess gold that to me it's probably going to take more time for me to get the gold into the gold rubber than money I might be able to get back from sending my gold rubber to a scrap. I'm actually not entirely sure that the refineries are taking gold rubbers. I should probably reach out, and actually somebody in here might know if we have anyone in the Society of Guilders that knows about. For those who don't know what a gold rubber is it basically has the kind of look and feel of a kneaded eraser a little bit. But ultimately it is, you can take like a crepe square, like one of these little guys, rubber cement erasers, and you chop it up finely and then soak it in kerosene until it gets to the right consistency. I think there's a video on YouTube called like the Midas Touch or something, where Trevor Lloyd makes a gold rubber, which is great. But yeah, the gold rubber will pick up any excess gold and keep it into its own little ball. And the idea being that you can then send it to a refinery and get a little bit of money back. But yeah, I'm just not using enough gold in this technique to make the time worth it. Does my finger introduce oil? It can, yeah. I don't know if did I touch something with my finger that was on the gold, or is that a more general question? I definitely do use oil from my finger, especially if I'm like trying to manipulate gold on a gold cushion. You can like get a little bit of oil from the side of your nose onto the back of a fingernail. And move the gold around as much or as little as you might need to. Okay. That's the question about the finger is when I fold the gold over with my finger, and I'm touching the gold, does that add oil to it? Maybe, possibly, but not enough to make any sort of difference. You can either brush it over with your finger, you can also blow it over using your breath, such as this. But yeah, just kind of lightly brushing it over with your finger is perfectly fine. And Brad asked, does W&B sell individual gold booklets or boxes of booklets? You can get a single booklet of gold leaf from W&B Gold Leaf, as far as I know, for their entire catalog. And one of the reasons that I love Waring and Billmeyer W&B Gold Leaf so much is that, like, when it comes to individual booklets of gold that they sell, they don't really mark it up all that much. Normally you would get a discount for buying by the box, which is, I do buy by the box, which is, I think, 20 booklets of gold, the pack. Buy it by the pack. Yeah, when you're ordering, make sure if you mean a single booklet, say booklet and don't say pack, because pack means something much different. It means 20 of a single booklet. But yeah, they, whether it's W&B Gold Leaf that you're buying from them or Minetti, the markup is nice and easy. And maybe it's a few dollars. Maybe don't quote me on that, but I did just recently get a couple single booklets of patent gold leaf with a backing, and that is also something to be aware of. Is I'm using loose leaf for this, loose gold leaf. So when I'm cleaning my gold out, I just wrap this cheesecloth around my finger and rub it onto the areas that I just tooled. Now, you have to be careful because there are some leathers that if you do that, it can either bruise or leave a halo around the tooling or something like that, which can be really detrimental to the design that you're doing. And then here, this is an orange stick. This is a manicure stick that I use to get any excess gold off of the wall of the impression. So effectively what I'm doing here is I'm going and hitting the other side, the other wall of the impression with the back of my orange stick to get any gold that might be loose or on the wall of the impression and get rid of it. And I'll do this on both sides. If I was doing this on titling, I would do it from the top, from the bottom, from the left, and from the right. Because there are lots of little intricacies. So, here, those 4 lines. Ultimately, you want something that's going to reflect the light evenly. And generally, with line work, you can get away with doing just one pass and having a solid gilt impression that is finished. But you can also go back into this with more gold. Who supplies it again? Yeah, it is W&B Gold Leaf. I forget if their website is simply W&B Gold Leaf spelled out. Here we go. Yeah, WBGoldleaf.com. I'll put the link in the chat there. Marilyn asks, when you tool a large binding with an elaborate design effect in egg glare, would you paste wash glare and tool in small sections, like, a quarter of the board so it doesn't dry out, or to try and finish the whole board in one go? It depends on the relative humidity of the studio in that day. If my relative humidity is something like 65, 70%, I could probably do the whole thing in one go, like this guy. But if your relative humidity is like 40, I would probably do something like this, either in thirds or, obviously with something like this where it's got decorative rolls around it, perhaps you could go ahead and do something like, an inch all around and then come back in and do the center to do it in 2 stages. But yeah, sometimes you do have to break things up because egg glare is so finicky, and you want to make sure that it's going to continue to work. And then if I was going to add another pass of gold, would I add more glare into the impression? Great question. Thank you for that. It depends. Yeah, so sometimes you'll need to reglare and sometimes you won't. When it comes to troubleshooting, and this is going to be probably the more important little section of my little talk. When it comes to having an impression that isn't quite working as you want it to, do I have anything else glared in? Did I glare it in twice? Oh yeah, I did. Okay. So I'll bring over this little guy that we started off with, and I glared in twice. My goal right now is to make a mistake, and I don't want to make a mistake on the actual book that I'm tooling. An easily fixable mistake by another pass of gold, but still I have this. So let's say the tool isn't hot enough, and I pick up gold. And let's just kind of sloppily try and put it in there. See if any of it stuck. All right. So you clean off your impression. It looks something like this. Now the first stage in troubleshooting is always to look at the face of your tool. If the tool has any like glare on it, sometimes if you tool with a hot tool and don't have gold in the way to protect the face of the tool, you can just pick up glare under the face of the tool, and then what'll happen is you'll go back into the impression however many times you want to try and fix it, and the glare that's on the face of the tool will just keep pulling the gold out of the impression. So the first thing is always is the face of the tool clean? And if it's not clean, you can polish it on this side with the honing compound until it is clean, because the gold will only be as reflective as the face of your tool is clean. Now, my first step after that, with the tool being clean, if the tool is already clean, then I move on. Now, this step, I'm going to tool with a hotter tool than I did before. And that is going to try to figure out whether or not the issue had anything to do with the heat of the tool. If, let's say, if I took too long to get the gold into the impression and the tool lost enough heat, then the gold might not stick. So heat it, cool it, polish it, pick up 2 layers of gold, and I'm always picking up at least 1 layer on the entire face, but generally I'm probably picking up 2 layers of gold. Then if I go into that impression, instead of folding it, I'll show you what it's like after. This is like 2 layers of gold. Now this is fine. This is, I mean, it needs more gold, but ultimately, like, this is not necessarily all that bad right now. The only time you're going to have to re-glare is when you go back into the impression and the gold isn't sticking. And if the gold isn't sticking and you tool it with a hotter tool and go back into it and the gold still isn't sticking, then you're getting into a situation where you will have to re-glare. And when you re-glare, what you're going to need to do first is clean that off, and then go in and clean out any little speck of gold, any little thing that, one, might not be secured to the book or to the leather, but also anything that's on the wall of the impression, any gold on the wall of the impression. If you go in and you put glare over it, the gold is going to stick there, and then you're going to have to spend a whole lot of extra time just trying to clean it off, and ultimately you're going to probably end up with a mark on your book or on your leather from having to go in and mechanically remove the gold. So I'm going to switch to this decorative tool, this little triangle. I'll do a few of them, and then we can probably either chat a little bit or figure out what all else needs to be covered, and then I'll let everyone go. So again, here I've got my gold on my gold cushion. It's cut slightly larger than the tool. I shouldn't be touching the top of my gold cushion with my finger there. Luckily, I'm going to pumice this thing afterwards, so I'm not too worried. And what I'm going to do as I pick up the gold, so this guy, I love these little guys. I'm sorry I'm moving the camera around so much. I'm just like trying to, I should be moving things just to be able to see anything. So what I'll do with this is I'll take a little bit of Vaseline from this part and rub it onto the inside of the cap. Then I'll have a cotton ball, and then I can just pick up a little bit of Vaseline on this cotton ball. That'll last for a nice long time. And what I'm going to do with the Vaseline is put it on the sides of the face of the tool. So the table, to bring back a term from earlier. Heat it, cool it, polish it. So I'm getting some Vaseline on the face of the tool for my polishing pad, but I'm also just going to put a little bit of Vaseline on the facets on the side of this tool. What that's going to allow me to do is, after I pick up I'm picking up 3 layers of gold. And I'm going to clear my sight lines. When you clear your sight line, I'm never pushing down. I'm never pushing up. I'm always going just completely horizontal. Just like that. And now you can see that the entire face of the tool is covered, but there isn't any overhang. So this will allow me to go into my impression and come right back out. Now, when I'm doing a decorative tool, slightly different to align because I'm not necessarily folding over and tooling again as much. And so I will go in and tool this with another 3 layers just as a matter of course. And that'll give me a little bit more reflective gold, a little bit brighter, a little bit kind of more layers on it. So Marissa asked, what was the sight line cleared by? This is just some cotton that I've wadded up into a little pad. Webril handy pads are what these are. The price went from like $20 to $40 over the course of the past number of months. So I've still got some of these, but as I move forward, I'm probably just going to use either cotton batting or you can use a flannel. There are a number of things that you can do. Basically, just something soft that you can use to press the gold against the side of the tool. Heat it, cool it, polish it. Now there is a little gap in here, and when you have tools that have an open face, let's talk about this one. Now, if when I'm cleaning the tool, or if when I'm cooling the tool, I somehow get a little droplet of water in there and I don't notice it, sometimes you can still polish it and it'll still have that water on it, so that when you go into your impression, the water then comes out onto your leather, and then you end up making your impression not knowing that you're burning the leather. And that's why oftentimes when I'm using a tool like this, I will blow just a real big burst of air into that middle just to make sure that it isn't gonna carry that water onto my book and then burn my leather. So heat it, cool it, polish it. And I don't need to put Vaseline on this tool every time. I did it that first time, and I'll probably be able to get through this entire, probably all of these, without having to re-Vaseline it. And there was a little bit of overhang, so I was able to fold it over. Clean it with the cheesecloth. Get it with my orange stick. Heat it, cool it, polish it. Pick up 3 layers of gold. Clear my sight lines. Again, this is just pushing up against the side of the tool. Loose grip till you're in your impression, then firm up and rock the tool to the point it needs to be rocked to. Robin asked, do you ever burnish the gold with an agate burnisher? Not like this. You would need just an incredibly fine agate burnisher, and you can actually burnish the gold with the face of the tool. And that's what I tend to do is the step of burnishing the gold happens kind of at the end. When you're done tooling, ultimately what you do is after you've cleaned it, moved everything to the point where it needs to be, and you don't have to, when you're doing a binding like this, what I'll do is I'll do everything on the rear board, get it to the point of completion, and then I'll go on and move to the other side. I'll do all of my cleaning. I'll do all of any kind of needing, if I need to go over impressions, if it needs just a little bit more gold, I will go ahead and do that on here before moving to the other board, just because it can, if you have an unfinished board, this is a small book, but if you can imagine a much larger book, you have an unfinished board, you start working on the other side. Every time you look at this, your heart's going to sink because it's just not quite right. It's not done. It isn't complete. And so definitely want to do things in areas first, like this entire bottom section in orange, a number of these lines, and then moving on after that. Now, if you haven't noticed, there's a little spot right here in this design that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, and just this little spot right here where there probably should be a tool like this. Basically what I'm going to do after I'm done tooling all of these and all of these, once those are all done to completion, I'm going to take my tool and I'm going to modify it. I'm going to remove material so that it fits within that small little area to complete this design in this little pillar right here. Which to me, right now, this looks unfinished. This looks like it's missing a big spot right there. I could leave it, that's fine. But I don't mind modifying the tool. Plus, I made the tool specifically for this binding. So there is a little bit of poetry there in a tool that once was able to do a full impression, but then no longer will be once I remove a bunch of that material. How do I tool the spine? For this one, very carefully. This particular angle that these lines are going is quite difficult to tool because effectively every little spot you want to tool your line so the tool is perpendicular to where the line is being made, but because it's going across the spine at a weird angle, it's actually a fairly difficult operation to get those where you need them to be. And the follow-up question about are there any special treatments for the impressions that go over the joint? Yes. This here kind of looks unfinished, but that's the spot where the joint is. So when you open the board up, it's not as much of an issue and your eye kind of fills it in a little bit. You can gild over the joint. The problem is when you move the board, eventually that gold is going to get disturbed and start kind of crackling off. So if I can have a sharp spot where the tooling ends and then starts up again, that's going to give you a little bit more of what you need. And so the same thing down here, there's just a little strip in there that I didn't build. And you can do that by just making sure you don't get glare right there. You can use some sort of like paper mask. You can take a small piece of paper and put it over that area. So there are ways to do that make it work. Dawn asks, can you tool that little spot using paper over where you did not want the gold? Yeah. I think that's exactly what I was just saying. I just didn't read the comment quick enough. So heat it, cool it, polish it. I'll just do one more of these triangles, and then we can kind of, I can go over burnishing, cleaning, a couple other things. As the tool is heating back up, I can use that time to clean off any excess gold. Could I tool the little spot? Gotcha. The question was actually, could I simply cover this area here that I don't want to have the tool instead of modifying the tool? You could, but you would need something there that was like hard enough that you're not going to make an impression there. And, you know, if you're doing like a run-up gilt spine, or if you're doing some other, you know, if you're trying to match a roll that goes into a corner, you can kind of like put something there, whether it's 10 point or 20 point or something in there to stop the gold from sticking. But for this case, I would much rather have the kind of finality and crispness of a tool that just fits perfectly in that spot, rather than what would definitely end up happening is I would get pressure over here, and you would kind of see a little, you know, maybe a little ghost or a little halo of that rest of that triangle. So not for this one, but that is definitely one way to kind of mask something off and get a partial impression. Picking up 3 layers of gold, clearing my sight lines. I didn't actually clear my sight lines too well, but I'll just go by touch. So this will definitely need some cleanup, possibly even another pass. But for the moment, I think that's fine. Okay, let's see what you're saying. Yeah, Richard's saying he burned the leather in blind tooling. A title impression having the tool hot and the leather too wet. And the solution that Dan Knowlton came up with was to fill the impression with auto body filler, sand it, and then design an onlay to cover it in the air. And the tool and tool the new design. Yeah. So, I mean, you can there are a couple things you can do if you make an impression that burns, and then you have to effectively cover it up in some way. It's definitely something that you can do where you can kind of fill the impression in with either like a mixture of leather dust and paste, or a leather dust and like a PVA paste mix to kind of fill in the impression. That's one thing you could do, and then put an onlay over it. And, you know, you can kind of polish the leather or burnish it smooth with a folder to kind of make it level after you add that mixture. You can also excise the leather and put an inlay there, whether it's something that you want to have as a decorative thing. And in some cases, you can actually just inlay the same leather that the rest of the book is covered in. And that can sometimes help you out. Yeah, and you can also, there are, if you like Bob Ross, there are happy accidents. I know design opportunity is another nice and fun phrase that you can address an issue with, and turn it into a hopefully positive thing. Yeah. I mean, any sort of inlay or onlay to go over it, depending on what it is. But yeah, I would think about either inlaying another material or filling the impression, doing an onlay, and then tooling it again, like Dan suggested. Paul asks, do I feel that the dyes used in certain colored goat skins affect the gold tooling? I haven't had that happen. You know, some dyes can be fugitive, but I haven't, you know, I mean, unless you're covering in red leather, and then just like after you're done tooling, just like really disturb the dye, with like by adding a whole lot of extra moisture and then moving it around. I haven't had that happen. I guess it could happen, but I haven't had that particular issue of the dye affecting the gold or the tooling. Robin asked if it's possible to review my process briefly for tooling the pattern on the orange leather. Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, building up the blind impressions was all the same. I did all of my blind tooling through my template and then removed it and then went through the further stages of blind tooling. The weird and difficult thing about that particular tool is that because it's not, and I ended up adding a little bit of a dome to the face because it was fairly flat. But where one meets the other, when you're going one and then the one underneath it, there's a little spot that like I can tell where it is on this, mostly because I know that it's right there. But I did go over those areas with this tool, which I modified to the same thickness of the lines here. And then I ended up making this even more curved than it was, so that I could hopefully just kind of blend those two impressions together as best I could. And so that's kind of what I was going on with that pattern of tooling on it. Tooling that one on the spine was especially difficult, but it's just the same process, and you're just kind of like reorienting where you're putting the pressure as you're rocking the tool over the spine. And Liz says, depending on the design and it's blind tool, you can go through it with carbon tooling. It depends on the burn, because if the burn, you know, like you can get either darkened leather or even blackened leather in the bottom of the impression, but like a proper burn is gonna leave a little bit more discoloration than just at the bottom of the impression. And so I wouldn't necessarily just add carbon over it, because in general, especially when I'm carbon tooling, you don't want it on the walls of the impression too much. And so that's something that I would probably not necessarily do. But here, I'll go ahead and burn this intentionally. And then maybe I'll do an area where I darken it just enough, just to give the illusion that it might be burned, but isn't quite. So yeah, this is a much too hot tool. The leather is too damp. I don't know if you guys can see it, but this actually, I can see the board underneath it. Or at least the very bottom of the leather, and it is no longer blue. So something like that, where you have burning and you have a bit of a halo around it can be difficult. If you do something like this and just kind of burn the bottom of the impression, or maybe slightly of the walls at the bottom of the impression, you could take a similar color leather and just like inlay it into that line. I would say better course of action would be not to make a mistake in the first place, but that doesn't always happen. So, yeah. In terms of, further and final steps of this kind of tooling, obviously the leather is dry. The book is completely dry, so I can go ahead and just kind of burnish any of these impressions if I want to. So I've got my tool. It is well below a sizzle. It's still fairly hot, but it is well below the activation point of the glare, and you're really gonna polish the face of the tool. And again, as always, hip square to the bench. I'm tooling perpendicular to the edge of the bench. I'm going into these impressions, and I'm gonna put down a decent amount of force and rock the tool side to side. And because it is lower than the activation point of the glare, I'm not going to pick up any gold from it. But what this will do is, if there are any specks of gold that like aren't completely down and into the impression, this will kind of sit them down. And then that will end up giving you an impression that is going to have a much more reflective quality to it. And yeah, I think, if you do end up using something like lighter fluid or some sort of solvent, like that, you do want to introduce, some oil, some, conditioner into the leather. I know Michael Wilcox loves his Kiwi brand neutral shoe polish, which what this will do is it'll kind of give the leather a little bit more life. It'll bring the luster down on the gold just a little bit, make it a little bit more subtle. And the way that you do that is you rub, you apply just a little bit with a cloth, work it into the leather, and then you take out your polishing iron, heat it up, and then work that in so that it really makes the leather accept the shoe polish. If any conservators are around who are concerned about the shoe polish thing, SC6000 is shoe cream 6000. So I'm not too worried about that. Cool. And yeah, thank y'all for your nice comments. Would I use synthetic glare on parchment? Fantastic question. Yes, and you can also use egg glare on parchment. So parchment is hydrophobic, and it is very, very susceptible to moisture. But even so, you can still do egg glare tooling on it. You have to be swift because you don't want to add too much moisture, because parchment will, when you add moisture, it'll expand a little bit and then it'll contract. And parchment is so strong that you may end up working against the pole. One thing that I found out that I've done ever since I found it out was that Sandy Cockerell, when he would do his parchment bindings, there are a number of ways to build up boards on parchment bindings that, try to counteract the pull, because parchment is such a strong material. He would simply line the inside of his boards with parchment, the same parchment that he was covering with. So you would have an equal pull And I have a bindings that I've literally just had out for probably a couple of years now. The inside of the boards are lined with parchment, and my relative humidity ranges from like 25% in the winter to like 60-70% in the summer. And I've never had this in a box, and it is absolutely perfectly stable. So that's a fun thing. But yeah, when it comes to tooling on parchment, you can also tool on parchment with synthetic glare, and it works real well. You just have to, as you're tooling on parchment, just be aware that it is a much more slippery material, and so it's a little bit more difficult to tool. But gold looks so good on parchment. Absolutely love it. Let's see. John McCrell asked, may he give the contact for finishing? So yeah, please. I didn't know that you were still. I didn't know if you were still doing them or not, but absolutely. I mean, this is one of your stoves right here. And unlike the other stoves that I have that I got secondhand, this one has had no problems in the like 9 or 10 years I've had it, or something like that. Jeff Peachy, how do I keep my apron so clean? This is my presentation. This is my nice. This is my dress up apron. I don't use it with glue. The other apron that I have has all of the glue residue and whatnot. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Raphael, yeah, so the I've got my handout on my website. It might take me a little while. I've got to, go through the recording, make sure everything is good. And hopefully I can get that up fairly quickly. But I'll post about it on my Instagram. Okay, cool. So if you want one of those large finishing stoves with a ring around it, it's John McCrell at Comcast.net. JOHNMACKRELL at Comcast.net. And yeah, if there aren't any further questions, I really appreciate y'all joining me here. I didn't expect it to be as big as it was, and I really appreciate it. And I'm really glad to be able to have this and be able to share what I know and my own process. Cool. Well, thank you all. And yeah, tonight it's time to practice. Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much, y'all. And yeah, hope to see you soon. Bye.